Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Now, I want to give you a preview of what you need to know before you go in and start healing dungeons in Season 2, because there is always a meta that is formed not only about overall healer output, which is very important, but also, what are the dungeons bringing in poisons, curses, diseases, and all that stuff. So we're going to go over what overall the dungeons are going to be looking at. We'll go dungeon by dungeon and talk about some of the hard to heal boss encounters and which of the healers are going to benefit the most from what these dungeons are really throwing at us. To start off, there's only one dungeon with poisons you have to deal with, and that's going to be Motherlode, but it is actually a prio kick. It's a prio interrupt with like the assassin mobs or the alchemist mobs. So surprisingly, you're not really going to see that many poisons in Season 2, but you're going to see an insane amount of bleeds. Almost every single dungeon features multiple prominent bleed effects on trash packs, a couple of them on boss fights, where there's just a lot more prio healing that's going to happen. You have some examples in like Darkflame Cleft, where there's bleeds on the very first boss encounter, and they're kind of just like stacking up over time, and you can kind of clear them out pretty quickly. But there's a lot of different bleeds, and most of them are pretty easily able to like heal through, but that's kind of where healer output and maximizing your overall output comes into play in a very, very big way. So be prepared for that. There's only two curse dungeons that you have to deal with in Theater of Pain and Rookery. These are not nearly as bad as Grim Batol or Stone Vault. So not having a curse dispel in your group is not going to be the end of the world. Same thing with poisons, because you can deal with these curse effects, and we'll dig into the specifics of how they work in the dungeon by dungeon part. By far the most important thing in this season is going to be multi-magic dispels, okay? Now what I mean by that is you have 6 dungeons: Priory, Theater of Pain, Cinderbrew, Mechagon, Floodgate, and Rookery that all feature trash packs or boss fights or both that you have 2 magic debuffs going out at a time. You can dispel one, and then you have to like prio heal the other one. That also means Dwarf is going to be really, really freaking insane in this incoming season. Not only for those bleeds, but for a lot of these multi-dispel packs or boss fights that you need to actually go up against. Probably some of the most egregious ones are areas where Mass Dispel is really, really good. At the end of Rookery, there's these Ascendant mobs, which will debuff the entire party. And you can Mass Dispel your way through that problem. You could single Dispel if you don't have Mass Dispel, and then you can kind of heal through everybody else to deal with it. But I would say in this incoming season, there's a lot of Mass Dispel value. There's a lot of purges as well, as mobs are going to get buffed. And there's a couple of enrages. Things like Theater of Pain are going to be a priority. And there's also a few different roots and snares that also need to be dealt with. Snares are effectively just slows on players, where you're going to have certain mechanics coming out in the dungeon, and then being able to shapeshift, phantasm, tiger's lust, whatever is going to be very, very helpful. Mobility is going to be a priority. Spot healing is going to be a priority. And there's a lot of really brutal heal checks. So let's talk about some of those in the dungeon by dungeon. With Cinderbrew Meadery, there's endless amounts of dispels when you fight up against these pyromancer mobs. They don't really deal that much damage with these debuffs, but it's something that can very quickly stack up, as most of the trash pulls in the dungeon are featuring some amount of unavoidable damage that will always happen. This is featured pretty heavily with some of the like brutes in the dungeon at the start, which are doing just like some burst AoE, and then they kind of throw shares at people for extra damage. You also have the B-Wing in Cinderbrew Meadery, which is featuring constant tank dispels. So in one side, you're going with pyromancers, which are debuffing DPS or healers. And then the other side with the B-Wing is just constant magic dispels onto the tank. The IPA boss is usually not that challenging of an encounter, but it does feature 2 dispellable debuffs that go out onto your party that need to be dispelled or healed through to deal with. The Brewmaster at the beginning of the instance also has 2 debuffs at a time that he's putting out into players, which cannot be dispelled, and that also is going to be very nasty. You also have the final boss, which features really like the most brutal of the healing checks at the moment on PTR, where you have 3 to 5, I want to say it's closer to 4 or 5 of these large canisters around the room, and you either have to use the boss's frontal or you have to use some of the debuffs that the boss is going to toss out onto players, which can also be dispelled, to detonate these large kegs, and then they're going to deal ticking damage, and if you don't clear them, then the boss's planned AoE around every minute when it reaches max energy is going to ignite them and trigger more damage. So it's a little bit like Edna, where you have these canisters that are going to deal damage, and you can kind of pick and choose when the damage is going to go out as it aligns best for you as a healer and like what your healing profile is. Very, very challenging boss fight to heal through on that one though. Darkflame Cleft is one of the few dungeons that features disease dispels, but they're not really that big of a deal. The pack moles after the first boss will just have these nasty nibbles that go out onto the tank. It's nice to have them and it just stacks up some more damage, but they're usually not too brutal of debuffs compared to some of the things we've seen in the past. So you have to keep that in mind, but this dungeon's really challenging for a lot of the tank healing, especially near the end of the instance, because they'll stack up these magic dots that cannot be dispelled. They're just debuffs that cannot be dispelled that will continuously stack on the tank if he keeps getting melee hit near the end of the dungeon before you fight the darkness boss. And those can be extremely, extremely brutal throughout the dungeon. There's also quite a bit of dot damage from bleeds that is featured pretty prominently, especially on the first boss. And you're going to have a couple of different magic debuffs around the instance, but they're not as brutal as some of the other ones going out later. What is really brutal is the Candlestick boss. Now, this is made exponentially easier by having immunities in your group, because the boss is going to toss out these wax clones of players, and they emit lots of ticking damage. The boss's mechanics itself will help you clear them, but you can clear them way faster if you just have somebody with immunities. We even had a mage walk into them, and you actually get stunned if you walk into them to clear them for 20 seconds. But since a mage can blink, they can basically just use blink on cooldown to walk into them, activate blink, break the stun, wait for the next blink, do it again. So having some of these immunities is really, really insanely helpful in dungeons like Darkflame Cleft. Mechagon recently got news that you're no longer going to be able to mind control any of the Tinkerers to have the detonation from like the squirrels. So that has been removed, so priests are not going to be able to benefit from that. But in Mechagon, there is a lot of benefits to having mass dispel, multiple dispels out. First, let's start off with the waste processors after the first boss. They do some really brutal tank bleeds. When you're in this garbage section, there's a lot of healing absorbs that you need to kind of like muscle heal through. I think there's some nerfs from the recent build that are actually reducing some of these, so it shouldn't be too bad. But before the second boss, you have the Junkyard Dogs, and they do a jump into a stacking magic dispel from these bites they put on players. They deal a lot of damage, and it's a huge area to time mass dispel, have dwarfs to remove debuffs, all of this stuff, because the damage is really, really insanely high. There is a dispel on Cujo, the second boss, which deals absurd amounts of damage, but it's probably going to get nerfed in the next build or two, because it's like almost one-shotting people if they don't have a defensive up. Really, really nasty. Shouldn't be that way. When you kill Cujo, you move on throughout the instance. You start fighting a lot of mechs, and so you feature it before the garden boss and before the Mechagon boss, where some of these larger mechs are going to do these arcing zaps. Now these can double stack on players, which is really brutal, and you basically have to insta-dispel them or they die. But it can also put the debuffs onto two separate players as well. So there's going to be some coordination check or telling people like, hey, use your dwarf racial and everything as fast as you possibly can. A lot of these zaps can also be diffuse magicked to reflect it back onto that other target, which does a ton of insane damage as well. So Monk's gonna have some good value out onto that one. When it comes to healing the boss fights, the very first boss fight has this like 2-second pulsing AoE. They had actually just nerfed it on February 4th, so it's not as long lasting and there's not as many mines, which is always nice. But it's basically just like every 30 seconds or so you have to heal like a bit of AoE damage. It wasn't that brutal, but was very brutal on the final boss, where you have to do a ton of spot healing to players that get giga zapped. They in fact on February 4th just nerfed the immediate damage, the imminent damage, by 50%, but it still does a ton of damage, especially as key scaling continues. And the mass AoE, while he is dragging everybody into these like giant magnets, that also does a ton of damage, which is increased the closer you are to some of his sparks. So prio healing is going to be a very, very big emphasis in the Mechagon dungeon. There's a lot of fights where you just kind of have to like dodge and run for your life as well. In the Motherlode, like I mentioned, this is the only dungeon that I saw featuring poisons. Now, the poisons are from like the assassin mobs, and they're also from the alchemists, both of which are kicks. And in the case of the assassin, it's actually a priority interrupt, because he'll try to cast Venom. It's like Venom Blade, and he basically poisons his weapons, and then his attacks both into the tank apply poisons, and then he does a Fan of Knives attack, which, if you play it correctly, it should just be like a burst of AoE, and then you use a stop on it, because it stops the channel, stops the cast from happening, and then you deal with it. But if the Venom Blade goes onto the Fan of Knives, then he does a burst AoE and applies the poison dot to the entire party. So it's a crazy Omega priority kick to deal with. Super, super important. If you do, you really shouldn't need that many poison dispels or anything like that, as most of Motherlode, I would say, is not too heavily featured when it comes to like a lot of like magic dispels or anything along those lines. There is a good amount of burst damage from some of the mechs that you're going to see around the room, because they basically cleave magic attacks onto the entire party whenever they make contact with a tank, which has resulted in a lot of strategies from BFA getting featured once again, where tanks are just kiting for their lives so that they don't die, but they're also not doing massive damage onto the entire party. In Motherlode, you're going to have the first boss where you're able to kick these like bombs into the tank mech thing, and then it's going to cause it to take a lot more damage. But he's also going to knock you back and apply a dot, which is featured a couple different times in these dungeons. So having some kind of mobile heal or some kind of instant heal you can drop onto your allies, or just good dispels, is going to be a very big priority. It not only just Motherlode, but a few different dungeons, because the knockback, especially if you're like very caster focused, can be really nasty. You also have your hardest heal check in the Motherlode featured on Azarok, the second boss. Now, this is kind of like City of Threads healing profile if you played in Season 1, where instead of having the dots get applied to your party, the boss actually empowers one of his ads. It's usually the healthiest ad. It causes it to start pulsing AoE until you kill it, and the boss also has a timer on its own stomp. So you can get this dot into a massive stomp and have to have everyone like burn all their defensives in order to make sure that they can survive it. So it's a really challenging encounter, not only because of the pulsing AoE, the combo effects, but the infinite scaling nature of M+ is going to make the prio target, the extra damage that you can apply to an enemy while you're healing, pretty noticeable from like party to party. If a healer is not able to actually add some extra damage, it could make the fight last quite a lot longer, since that mob must die before some of these nasty combos go out and you run out of defensives to actually properly deal with it. In Operation Floodgate, there's an enormous amount of magic dispels that you have to deal with. You have the tank dispels from Black Blood Wounds, and you also have these nasty electricians in the later half of the instance, where you are constantly pulling multiple electricians at a time, and you need to dispel them while dodging all these puddles and all this huge AoE damage. Almost every single trash pack has like a heal check of some kind, whether it's more priority focused with the architect mobs you're going to fight early in the instance as you're clearing away all the bombs, where they're going to nail you to the floor and have a bleed component attached to it. We just need to prio heal those targets and try to kill off the electricians as fast as you can. You're also going to have a lot of prio healing based off the third boss in Swamp Face, which is going to tether the DPS and healer together. So you're going to have two groups of two, where you're going to be tethered to this person. You have to stand with them while the boss radiates ticking damage, and then you have to stay with this person as you're dodging all these puddles and still healing through the heavy AoE. It's really a heal check fight and can be quite brutal to deal with. So mobility, healing on the move, having some defensives ready for when you have to run all over the place and can't be healing people is going to be a big priority. And the final boss of Floodgate is kind of the opposite, where there's planned, consistent AoE burst damage every single time that the boss reaches max energy. I believe it's about every minute. You have to do a lot of burst healing. But in between that, you're going to have players get giga zapped, and they have to just get healed through it for 4 or 5 seconds, and they can't touch any of the water, otherwise they electrify it, cause a whole bunch of issues for your party. So you jump between the burst AoE healing and prio healing on the final boss, and then on Swamp Face you just have to deal with like rot damage all the time. Priory features an enormous amount of various healing profiles you have to deal with. There's a lot of bleeds on trash packs. There's a lot of unavoidable like spot healing focus you have to deal with on trash packs. And that doesn't even include the mini bosses, which all have their own mechanics, all have their own damage. 2 of the mini bosses you have to fight, the guard captain at the very start of the instance, and the forge master in particular on the right side of the courtyard before the first boss. They both do big AoE damage that slows you. And you can remove that slow on the forge master side with just like a mass dispel or single dispels, and that'll also remove some of the dot component that gets added onto it. But the slows on top of like caltrops and traps and things like that to dodge all over the floor, fire puddles on the side of the forge master can be really, really nasty. We're experimenting with some like safe spots and like where to stand so that you don't get affected by some of these, so stay tuned for that. There also, at least last time I played, were purge effects where you can start dispelling some of the enemies' inner fire buffs, and then it'll also stun those mobs. So being able to prioritize purging is going to be really powerful for a healer if you have access to it. On the second boss, on the Baron, he's basically just a full-fledged paladin, but he also buffs his own damage, which can mean more tank pressure, but it also means added slows and damage to some of his other mechanics. So he'll basically divine toll the entire party, and then it also slows you as you're trying to run out of void zones. So mobility, being able to get out of snares is incredibly, incredibly important on this boss fight. The last boss fight also features a very similar City of Threads type combo mechanic, where the boss is going to empower herself and start radiating ticking damage on you, and then she'll cast a blinding light. Now you have to turn around for the blinding light so you don't get basically one shot, but if you're at a low enough key level, you'll just be disoriented until you get dispelled. That being said, as you start going into higher keys, you're going to get a combo of the ticking damage, and then when you turn around to deal with the blinding light, it's also going to do another burst of damage on its own. So it's very possible that somebody could be taking that ticking damage and the burst from the blinding light, even though they do it correctly, and potentially get like double tapped. And you have to make sure you're kind of like over healing at those times to make sure everybody's as healthy as they possibly can be. Some very, very nasty mobs. And there's a lot of healing you have to do on the trash pulls because basically every single minion is doing a lot of unavoidable damage. That being said, it's kind of a good thing because there's a lot of kicks in Priory, but many of them are just kind of like random bolt damage, kind of similar to what we experienced in Stone Vault, where, yeah, it'd be nice if you can kick everything, but if some alloy bolts go off in Stone Vault, it's not going to be the end of the world. Obviously, if like 4 of them go into one target, they might die, but if you have enough of them under control or enough of them desynced from each other, you're usually just going to be able to heal through that effect and then be ready for like the next hit that might go out onto your allies. Rookery might be one of those dungeons you kind of spam for your weekly 10s and might be one of the easier ones to deal with, but it also does feature one of the few curses that you're actually going to experience in this dungeon pool. Now, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it's not a major curse the way you'd see it at a Stone Vault or Grim Batol, where it's like you really need to dispel this or somebody dies. What it does is it just deals extra dot damage and then drops void puddles. The void puddles will hurt a lot if you stand in them, so you just kind of have to move out of it. The major issue with this curse is that it happens in conjunction with unavoidable party damage. The larger of the monstrosities, I guess you could call them, before the second boss fight, do these large puddles, big AoE damage, they suck you in, so mobility is a priority, and just good positioning is going to be a priority because you also want to make sure that whoever has the curse dispel is not dropping puddles where you're going on top of that. Lots and lots of trash pulls with unavoidable AoE that you just have to be ready to like walk into the pull and immediately start healing. There also are going to be a lot of kicks at the beginning of the instance, but you can start using your purge if you have access to it to deal with some of the casters, make them do a little bit less damage as a result. It's really, really helpful to have access to it. And near the end of the instance is where you have to start fighting the Ascendant mobs. You encounter your first one right after the second boss, and basically you have to dodge some orbs, and then you have to deal with this debuff that goes on the entire party. You can mass dispel it, or you can also just prep healing in advance and then blast healing to clear the debuffs because it's a negative heal absorb as well. So if you just have a ton of healing, you can mass dispel it, quote unquote, from your party and then not have to deal with anything afterwards. It's one of those effects that's like really easy to deal with if you know it's coming, if you're planning for it, if you're expecting it. So watch out for these Ascendant mobs as you're going in and healing for the first time. There also are some trash pulls from some of the larger elementals and near the end, which basically need to have an extra action button being used to stop them from like pulsing crazy raid damage and dropping puddles at your feet. So keep that one in mind, as some of the trash near the end of the instance can be very, very brutal. The final boss is kind of challenging in its own right because it makes positioning so much more important. If you are in a bad spot as 2 debuffs go out onto your party and you get dispelled really where the rest of your team is, it keeps on expanding this corruption field, and it deals like moderate damage, but you just kind of run out of space to position, which can be really nasty. You also need to have the group more or less spread most of the time because you get knocked back, and then you have like 3 or 4 circles that need to be placed on pillars. Otherwise, they're going to spawn ads, and that's not going to be good either. So there's like crazy raid damage if you have one of these ads that get spawned and you need to use the circles to preemptively destroy them. That being said, the fight, if you do it correctly, is not too brutal to actually heal through. It's just one of those things that as a healer, you have to be really ready if you see any of these pillars come up, and if one of these ads does spawn, because you're going to have to heal through it, your team is going to have to prio target it down, and if they don't, it's going to be insanely nasty. So get prepared for that one. Theater of Pain has some really nasty mechanics. There's multiple different enrages throughout all of these dungeons, but a lot of them are basically just make the mob do like 10% more damage, 20% more damage, something like that. The enraged Bloodhorn at the beginning of the instance, however, must be soothed in order to stop its AoE damage from just pulsing like crazy. So this is the dungeon where it'd say you must bring a soothe, or you must do insane amounts of damage with all your cooldowns and just burn the Bloodhorn down immediately the second you see it. Up to you. But if you're in a group that does not have a soothe, be prepared to do a lot of healing at the start with those Bloodhorns. You also are going to have an incredibly long debuff on the entire party that you need to heal through on the first boss with the Withering Touch. You can dispel just like yourself or one other person who you know is going to take some more damage. Dispelling a tank is never a bad idea in that situation if you can't clear everybody's debuff, since the damage on the tank as they fight the front of challengers at the beginning of the instance can be really nasty. There's also tons of prio bleeds you have to heal throughout this dungeon, so be prepared for that. There's some trash mobs that are having like mass AoE, and one of them is the Portal Guardian as you're going to Kultharok in the like undead wing, I guess you could say, or I guess it's more of the caster undead wing in that area. But basically it's a big ghost, green ghost, that is going to apply 1 curse to an ally, and that curse is going to cause them to take extra damage from the mass AoE. So if you don't have a curse to spell, it's not the end of the world, but you're going to need to like drop really big externals on them or have them use big defensives on themselves to survive that mass AoE that's going to be going out. Really cool thing is that taking the portals actually tops off your health pool in the Kultharok wing. So anytime you need to take the portals or you have to choose between topping somebody off, just take the portals because it heals you up and then you're going to be able to move on. In the Duelist wing, Zav the Unbroken or Unfallen, whatever his name is, puts up these banners that radiate a pulse that doesn't do any damage, but it slows you with every pulse. And I think it stacks up to about 5 times. Now, these are technically snares. And so what you can do is you can use talents like Phantasm or Tiger's Lust that will remove a snare effect. And what happens is if you have like 5 stacks of a slow, you can't move anywhere. You activate Phantasm, it removes those 5 stacks, but then the banners pulsing will start building them up again. So you can effectively kind of use it like a sprint where you have to be somewhere else really quickly to dodge. Well, you can use the fade at that right time to drop your stacks and then move to where you need to be. But also keeping in mind, if they don't kill banners, then you're going to get slowed again very quickly. Keep that in mind. There's a few different purges in the instance, specifically for like bone shields to just get rid of. And really, a lot of the encounters are not that dispel heavy or anything. It's going to be more like prio healing focused, where you're spawning ads and on like Kultharok or even the final boss, and you have to just deal with some of like the mass AoE that's happening as like the Nova is like drawing people in on like the final boss and dealing with some of the healing there. I would say in general, the healing checks in this instance are probably some of the lightest ones, but there's a lot of just like hard punishment for failing mechanics. So if you're playing on lower key levels, you might be like healing somebody through a curse or through a stun because they stood in bad or something like that. So keep that in mind as you're going into this instance. There's not too much of this unavoidable damage on some of the boss fights. It's going to be so brutal to heal through unless people start making a lot of different mistakes. So in general, the curse dispels in these dungeons are not too brutal and you can play around them. Bleeds are constant and everywhere, and there's going to be a lot more prio healing you have to deal with. The boss encounters themselves have a good mix of burst AoE damage and single target prio healing damage that you need to deal with. It's a lot more varied of healing checks than you had in Season 1, where basically everything was just going to be mass AoE all the time. That being said, the rot fights that we have so far both kind of have burst elements in Swamp Face and in the Candle King. And I would say Swamp Face is probably the hardest healing check that we have, at least from a consistent basis at the moment, because you just need to do so much for a long period of time. I would not be surprised if some nerfs come into it on that end, but it is going to be like the Khajiit encounter of the Season 2 dungeon pool that we're going to have going on right now. In general, I think this is a really strong season though for Disc Priest. Shocker, I know, but there's a lot of opportunities for Mass Dispel. There's a lot of humanoids that you can use your Mind Suit to get around. There's a couple opportunities for Shackle Undead in like Theater of Pain if you needed it as well, but you basically have the healing profile to deal with rot damage and with burst AoE, and with the changes they made to Evangelism, where you can do like 10 million healing to split between all allies with Atonement on them. You can also just put 2 Atonements out when you don't have your pets out or anything like that, and then you just blast Evangelism, and then it pumps 5 million into each target, and then you can kind of resolve some of the prio healing requirements that you have going on throughout some of the boss fights. So I think Disc has both some of the utility required and then the spell profile required, and just really, really high overall HPS. It's making it look really strong. Mistweaver has a lot of the same things. Revival is going to be really nice to clear a lot of these overall debuffs, and they do have what I would argue is better trash healing than Disc Priest right now to deal with some of the challenges that are being thrown at you with the instance and people just standing in bad. I think Mistweaver kind of plays into a little bit of what Shaman was at the beginning of Season 1, where it was like the better pug healer. When people are making mistakes or people having issues or something like that, you can just heal through the problem or interrupt it, crowd control it yourself. So I think these two are kind of the top dogs right now for many of the reasons, but also because there's not as many poisons or like massive curses where you just need to have like 2 curse dispels or something in like a group the way you would in Grim Batol. There is going to be a lot of advantages, I would say, for playing Priest in the next incoming season. Potentially, even if like Holy Priest could do pretty well. I know they're kind of lacking in the output department, but they could always play like Oracle, and the Insight cooldown reduction ability could give you multiple different single target dispels over and over again. So even if you didn't have Mass Dispel one moment, you could actually just spam Dispel. I think it'd be a little bit too big of a sacrifice for Disc to go Oracle, personally. But Holy absolutely could, and it could be really, really helpful for what goes on in a lot of these instances. So be ready for healers to take all those movement speed bonuses or snare removals or root removals, because there's quite a bit of them, and there's way more movement required in these dungeons than there was in Season 1 as well. Let me know if I missed anything, or if you have any other questions I didn't quite get to in these previews. We will have our dungeon guides coming out before the season gets started as well, so keep an eye out for those, and be sure to subscribe if you're getting this far and enjoying all this content. Big love to our patrons who make all the content possible. If you want to check that out, check it out in the description down below. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.